Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us from different parts of the world. Today, we have an ensemble of digital and product experts for a 30 minutes discussion on how AI and generative AI can be leveraged in the knowledge management space. We will also deep dive into specific use cases today. So, for this panel discussion, we are joined by Nate Bourns from DAI. DAI is a global development consulting firm and a frontier market investment bank at the vanguard of international development initiatives in 160 plus countries. As the Senior Vice President of Global Strategy, Nate is responsible for developing and executing the global strategy of DAI. From Evalueserve, we have Shobit Saxena, who manages tech solutions for professional services as well as asset and wealth management clients. His focus is predominantly on product and tech solution development and strategy. We also have Mihal Radziuk, who is the customer success lead based out of Romania and leads a team of professionals responsible for driving awareness and adoption of tech solutions, including knowledge management. Before we begin the webinar, I just wanted to highlight two important checkpoints. Number one, the webinar is for 30 minutes and we will have 5 minutes of Q&A at the end. So please feel free to post your questions via the chat window. The webinar will be recorded and shared with everyone who has registered. So without further ado, let's begin the webinar discussion. First, I would ask Shobit to share his perspective on the current knowledge management landscape and how generative AI is being leveraged and will be leveraged and how it's evolving.
Thank you, Alan. And it's a pleasure being here. It is indeed an interesting time for knowledge management, especially with the evolution of generative AI over the past 2 years. So in terms of landscape, let me start with two things which have changed. First is knowledge management now comes with different names, and that's broadly an evolution. While knowledge management or KM as a term continues to be used by most of the firms and industry bodies, there are synonyms from enterprise intelligence to unified knowledge. We are seeing different names, some even being creative names with organizational meaning and context. It's not just rebranding or modernization. A key reason for these name changes, nomenclature changes, is convergence of knowledge management with different use cases. So till few years back, knowledge management used to be a central firm-wide initiative for most global companies. Now smaller teams, functions like pre-sales, business development, proposals, competitive intelligence teams, many of these teams and functions, they are trying their hands at knowledge management via smaller decentralized initiatives. And when these teams are getting involved, and of course, they are giving it new names. So that's the first thing in terms of trends, which we see as changing. Next, especially with the advent and evolution of generative AI over the last 2 years, entry barriers that are typically associated with knowledge management are coming down.
Maybe, Alan, we continue and Shobit would join in a second.
Sure. So let's go to the next question. And Nate, I will pose this question to you. So Nate, I want to understand how the approach of business leaders has changed towards knowledge management over the last 2 years, and what is your perspective on that?
Sure, Alan. First of all, great to be with you. And I see Shobit's back, but I'll just go ahead and answer this, and we can come back to you, Shobit. I did want to hear what you were going to say. I'm not a knowledge management expert. I'll say that right up front, and I don't have a good name change for it. I do think it needs a name change from my perspective, but I don't have one yet for it. For me, and this is I'll be a bit contrarian here, speaking with people that know more about knowledge management than I do. Knowledge is not really, for me, a separate thing that gets managed in a straightforward way, at least. DAI, my company, we work in very challenging contexts around the world. Some maybe somewhat unique set of circumstances, but I can imagine many of the companies that are represented on this call face similar circumstances. We have highly decentralized operations, local teams operating around the world, and we work in virtually every sector of international development, health, education, enterprise development, governance, finance. And we do that in most countries around the world. On any given day, we might have an expert advising the Minister of Finance in Jordan, another one working on environmental engineering in a hydroelectric project in Nepal, and another one trying to figure out how to get access to climate finance in Colombia. And so for us, this decentralization is that Shobit was talking about is a really important development, decentralization of the tools as well. But it brings with it some challenges that I hope we can discuss a bit more. We want to know how to figure out what works and who's working on what that we could connect to. And all of this matters at the point of extraction. And so it comes back for us to what does the user need in the moment in which they're trying to get their job done? And we kind of work back from there. And so I'm sure you all have thought about better ways of framing that. That's kind of the way I think about knowledge management these days. Now, of course, generative AI in particular, but AI more generally over a longer period of time is substantially changing what's possible, what you can do with knowledge management. And if you think about that decentralization Shobit was talking about, at one level, it's like decentralized to the individual user who's got a subscription to GPT Plus or Claude Opus or Copilot. I mean, that at that level, that's super decentralized, but the tools are very general. They are incredibly broad, so the breadth is amazing. And the challenge that we see is that the depth is highly variable. And so in any one domain, it can be really, really capable or not very capable. And you can only tell that by either experimenting or having some expertise in that domain. So that's, I think, an important factor to consider as you think about also custom tools and custom approaches to using these large language models in any sort of a knowledge management system. I know this is happening many different ways around the world, but that there's a now famous study. I'm sure some of you have seen it about the BCG consultants working. It was studied by Harvard and Wharton. Ethan Mollick in particular has made this one pretty famous. But this study is famous for how clear the results are in terms of improving productivity of knowledge workers and consultants specifically. What's less often cited, if you go and read the study itself, is that the performance significantly decreased when they gave the consultants a challenge that was outside the frontier of that tool's knowledge, and you just didn't know where that frontier is, and you're never going to know exactly where it is because it's changing. And that really presents some significant challenges when you're looking at building sort of enterprise level generative AI tools, because that frontier is going to gradually change over time, or sometimes pretty significantly when you switch from one model to the next. And again, so just to round out this answer to your first question here, Alan, I think this brings us back to some of the business case basics. So you've got to start, if you're thinking about doing something custom with these tools, you really got to start with where the value can be created, and then work backwards to what the user interface should look like at the point of extraction, so the user who would use that knowledge or that connection that's being made really will get the right value out of it. And sort of, so we don't, we're not exempt because of these tools from the sort of rules that we've learned about creating a good business case around investments. So I'll stop there and maybe come back to Shobit.
Yep. Thanks, Nate. This was very helpful. Shobit, I'll let you complete your point on the market landscape of knowledge management and how generative AI is influencing it.
Yeah, I was talking about entry barriers coming down. Nate also touched upon some of those aspects, especially with generative AI. Because of entry barriers coming down, as a solution provider, what we are seeing in the market is definitely an increased pace of conversations where knowledge management is an underlying business objective. In many cases, clients that we work with, global firms, knowledge management is back at the table being a senior leadership discussion point. As a result, the speed with which investment decisions get taken, that has also increased. In parallel, we are also seeing an increased coverage of KM solutions by technology analysts, the likes of Forrester, over the last 1 year. So this space continues to show signs of increasing momentum from different angles. So I spoke of two things that I've seen which have changed. Now, one thing which remains same and has gained more and more prominence. So Nate also touched upon some of the business values, objectives attached to knowledge management. That has remained the same. So when you think of knowledge management, that the business objectives that you would associate to it even 5 years ago, these have remained the same. For example, reducing duplicative work of colleagues and employees, finding ways to tap into tacit knowledge, especially in the professional services businesses, retaining knowledge when employees leave or change roles or when they solve complex problems, how to retain that knowledge for future generations, knowing who to contact for what, the perpetual knowledge management problem that pretty much every company is looking to solve or improve on. And lastly, companies, enterprises continue to look at knowledge management as a tool to drive competitive edge. More and more, that realization is there, and that's why it is getting factored into strategy right at the topmost level for many companies. So yeah, that completes my thoughts on landscape. Alan, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Shobit. We agree knowledge management is surely inevitable and will be at the center stage. You spoke about some of the entry barriers, but we would want to dive a little deeper into this point. And it would be good to understand some of the legacy challenges associated with knowledge management and if they are changing now. So, Mehal, I would request you to share your perspective first, and then we can go to Nate.
Thank you, Alan, and hi, everyone. So maybe I'll draw a comparison. It's like deploying Microsoft Teams or Slack or any other collaboration tool. It doesn't magically solve your communication issues. And it's kind of similar with knowledge management. So what we are seeing is that the artificial intelligence alone, it will not transform your knowledge management. And we talk with lots of our clients, and one pattern I see is that lots of the conversations that we have, they start with topics which are related to AI, GenAI, but very often the same conversation ends with topics which are related to data and data quality. And I'll give you some examples. Large consulting firms, Nate was mentioning BCG, but pretty much every global consulting firm, they produce thousands of different documents every day. If you apply generative AI on them without proper data tagging organization, the results that you would be getting would be suboptimal. And we have seen it a couple of times ourselves as well. And one big challenge that we see, and we also try to solve for our client, is data annotation. So looking at the different knowledge assets and also give them some more context by adding meta tags, by adding labels as well. And we have learned it could be pretty tricky because each organization, they have your own taxonomies. The complexity of the data assets is also changing. I mean, the data assets or knowledge assets are becoming more complex. There are also lots of technical considerations that you need to take into account. There are duplicates. There are things relevant to versioning of the documents. So I think the old saying, garbage in, garbage out, it applies really well to generative AI as well. Nate, maybe we can turn to you. What's your take on the challenges? What did you experience at the AI?
Well, I'll tell you, Mikhail, when I first started experimenting with generative AI early on, when everybody else was sort of focused on it, I guess at the beginning of ChatGPT, I got really excited that perhaps we didn't have to have any more of these long conversations about taxonomy. As a non-KM practitioner expert, I thought, well, maybe we can get rid of that stuff. It turns out you can't really quite get rid of it. It still matters what a document is, what it's meant to do, what a connection could leverage for your company, etc. So we've come back to that, but past efforts, some of the legacy challenges, poor user adoption, fragmented data, the lack of integration across decentralized business processes. We faced all of those things, continue to face some of them. I'm sure many organizations still do. Even basic search at times can be challenging, but this is all a lot of this is getting easier with the technology. But like Michal, like you said, the technology and the new, and putting an LLM to reason over a disparate set of documents that are meant to do many different things is not going to solve your challenges. We tried. We tried that. It didn't work. The thing about this is that experimentation is relatively inexpensive, and so you can try things out pretty quickly. You can also spend a lot of time doing lots of experiments that may, even if they succeed, not create value. So you do have to focus your experiments still. So I think you do want to still start with where it is that we can plausibly create value for our customers, for society, and for the company, and come back to what's needed in order for that approach to work. Again, some of the enterprise-specific use cases, you really have to allow for some of that experimentation. And to Michal, your point about data, I couldn't agree more. It's like the unsexy thing that we were hoping this would help us just sort of solve, but you actually do have to do a bit of curation. Still have to do some, helps to do some tagging if you want to have, a more sort of enterprise tailored approach to this. The GenAI proofs of concept are remarkably easy to get set up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to scale it or create value for the end user across the company. We expect the tools to continue to evolve. Like the saying, I think it's Ethan Mollick who says, this is the worst AI that you're ever going to use going forward. And so, expect that this will continue to improve and the capabilities will continue to evolve. For us, DAI has a social mission, and we expect to be able to translate these capabilities into value for society and value for our shareholders at the same time. And so we try to stay on top of some of how this is evolving. We're seeing the tools that are getting embedded within standard enterprise systems are getting better and better. But again, they can be quite expensive. So you need to track whether it's creating value. And the point I'll come back to. And again, just would reiterate, Michal, your point about don't think you're going to jump over some of the data, the basic data management and basic user interface designs are still really important. If you're trying to guide the user to accomplish a certain type of task in a way that's augmented by generative AI, you're still going to have to think through all of the normal user interface and user experience type issues that you would have had to do before GenAI was sort of broadly in use.
Great, Nate. Thank you. There were some good challenges that you've listed down, but also the point that we take away is that we are in a continuous space of experimenting and evolving so that we're able to adopt technology to its best use. I would want to navigate further and would want to understand if the adoption of generative AI-powered tools requires a slightly different approach. And I would pose this question to you, Michal, and would want to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And it's actually something I experience personally every day. And so my point of view is that in principle, I feel the adoption process for GenAI features and non-GenAI features is very similar. But the barriers for users are very different and possibly more complex. And what I mean that the process is very similar is that we look at the adoption as a funnel. It starts with awareness. We are making sure that users know the GenAI features. Once people know it, we need to activate them. So nudge users to actually test it or use it for the first time. Then we are making sure that we have proper engagement, loyalty, advocacy. So the process is pretty much the same. What I feel is unique for generative AI features or platforms are the user challenges. So just to give you a couple of examples, building trust. It might be more difficult because all the questions around quality of output or security or data confidentiality. Then we have the skill gaps, very important. We've spoken about education. For example, not everyone is a prompt engineering expert. So our adoption process needs to consider that, that element of education. And apart from that, what we are sometimes seeing is that the usage patterns for generative AI features might be slightly different than for the traditional features. And again, I'll give you an example based from Evalueserve experience. Sometimes we are seeing that the user sessions for GenAI features are shorter, but more frequent. So what happens is that users log into the platform, they ask some questions to the bot, for example, and then they log in after a couple of hours for another question. It's not either good or bad, but as Nate was saying, this needs to be considered even at the product design stage. So ensuring that the UX would be also reflected in those new usage behavior, usage needs. And also when you build the adoption strategies, this education, trust aspect need to be taken into account as well. Alan, back to you.
Great. These are all valuable insights. A lot to learn, specifically in terms of challenges, how generative AI is evolving, the adoption, and all of this. But when we put this into context, it would be good to understand some use cases, right? Real world application on how generative AI as a technology can be put into use in the knowledge management space. So Mehal and Shobit, I would want to learn from you some real use cases that you have on top of your mind.
Yep, I can go first, Alan. So when we think of generative AI, by default, most people would think of a question and answer interface, a chatbot, right? But two use cases on top of my mind are where generative AI plays a very different role. In some cases, goes beyond being a chatbot. First is the role of generative AI in content creation, specifically getting the first draft of content right, leveraging generative AI. So Nate and Mihal both spoke of the criticality of data quality. But once that step is achieved, GenAI can be a great tool for creating first draft of content. And here, I don't really mean create complex documents and content and analysis via generative AI, but to put in the effort to identify which sections of a large document I can get a good draft from generative AI, or what type of content generative AI is a good fit for. So that is where at Evalueserve, we are doing a lot of work. I was thinking maybe I'll show a sample of what we are doing as well. Alan, if you could let me know if my screen is visible.
It's visible now, yeah.
Okay, so this is PublishWise, our web platform for content search and discovery. It has a digital assistant which takes care of Q&A based information discovery. What we also have here, to touch upon my point on content creation, are these agents, generative AI powered agents or actions to create first draft of content. What you see here, these are all examples, because when we implement PublishWise, we work with clients on what is more relevant. But just some thought starters. Generative AI can be used to create first draft of summaries for service lines or offerings, which often people need to put into their deliverables. Create case studies. Getting to know more about a topic works really well for new joiners, right? When they want to know more about something which already exists in manuals and different type of documents. And similarly, to create company profiles, create structured summaries of documents, ability to analyze, compare documents to identify what are the differences, where are the similarities between two contracts, for example. So a lot of interesting applications of generative AI in creation of content, the first draft. So that's the first use case on top of my mind. The second is what Nate touched upon, the unsexy parts of knowledge management. So that's content management. And here also generative AI goes beyond being a chatbot. So if you think of content management, it still is an entry barrier, and in many cases, a difficult process to maintain on an ongoing basis. Uh, Generative AI has a role to play right from annotation, auto tagging, tagging of documents and content that Nihal touched upon, summarization of large complex documents and content pieces. So creating these summaries first draft from a content management point of view is an area where generative AI can be used. Similarly, sanitization of content. If you think from a organizational knowledge sharing point of view, many of the documents, content might have sensitive information like dollar value of contracts, materially non-public information. In many cases, there is a need to sanitize documents before making them available organization-wide. And a lot of interesting work from Evalueserve side, we are also doing in these spaces, annotation of content, sanitization. So what we do for annotation is our KM analysts, experts, they essentially sit and translate taxonomies into prompts, basis the nuanced understanding that we have of the domains. And then generative AI engines run these prompts, essentially giving an output, which is the first level of tagging, which is then validated and reviewed by the analyst as required before feeding into publish wise, or in some cases, even KM and generative AI applications that our clients have. So if you ask me, these are the two use cases I would say are the next frontiers for generative AI with a lot of interesting developments. Nihal, what's on top of your mind in terms of use cases?
Yeah, maybe I'll mention one shortly because I know we have 2 minutes left. I think one frequent questions that we get from our clients is also how to leverage GenAI on both structured and unstructured data sets. And by structured data sets, I mean Excel databases, so numbers heavy content. And by unstructured, I mean, in our cases, this would be text heavy content. It could be also images, it could be something else. And what we are seeing that some teams that used to, and some of our clients that used to actually use BI tools for different data, financial data, it could be sentiment data, it could be something else, are also trying to figure out how this data could be also enriched with the knowledge that the LLMs have and the qualitative data that might be sitting in some market reports. And by marrying those two data sets, we are achieving two things. One, we are decreasing barriers for the data consumptions because not everyone is a Power BI or BI expert. And of course, LLMs give you opportunity to ask questions and get some responses, maybe even some charts, basic calculations. And second thing you can achieve through that is, I think, much more contextualized responses and much more deeper responses. So you're not just looking at the evolution of the KPIs, but you can also ask questions why some things are happening. And yeah, as I said, we are doing lots of R&D on this topic. And yeah, if someone is interested in knowing more, we are open to have a follow-up discussion. But I know time is up. So Alan, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mihal, Nate, Shobit. Very valuable insights on knowledge management and how it's evolving, specifically from a generative AI perspective. We have one question, which I would just, share quickly. So do you feel that there need to be change in the way that knowledge is traditionally written for it to work successfully with AI? Example for consumption for LLMs, etc.
I can share a quick response on that. If you look at the entire process of knowledge management, this is a critical step. Even with generative AI, the criticality of this step remains. So there is a need to look at how you are generating knowledge, how you are saving it for future use, how you are managing the life cycle of that. That entire process still is very relevant and critical for the success of the initiative. Maybe there are a few parameters in that entire process which needs to be looked differently with generative AI. So in terms of saving information technically, maybe there are a few more approaches that needs to be considered. But overall, our view is the criticality of thinking through this, giving it the due attention remains.
Great.
Yeah.
There are a few questions that I received directly. One of them being on, what is your viewpoint on security?
So again, I can provide my quick comments on this. What we are seeing in conversation with clients, the security conversations, they happen much more early now in KM related solutions. So the information security teams, the compliance teams from a privacy standpoint, get involved much more sooner, because there is, in some cases, companies just want to be very confident at the outset that security, privacy is taken care of. It's an evolving space. A lot is evolving from the provider side of you, the ones who provide the LLM services. But definitely security is of paramount criticality. So conversations like on-premise deployment, all of these discussions are taking good amount of time early on in conversations.
Great. We have a few more questions. So what we'll do is we will answer them directly via email. Just to let the audience know, the session is recorded, so we will be sending the recording, and we'll also send invitation to set up meetings in case you would want to deep dive a little further, understand more on how we are leveraging generative AI, and understand your use case or business problem and help solve it. So we'll send out follow-up emails by tomorrow, so you can touch base with us again. Great. Thank you, Shobit. Thank you, Mehal. Thank you, Nate, so much for your insights.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Alan.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.